Here, welcome back for video lecture number 4. I wanted to start by just drawing your attention to an email I sent you this morning. It's Saturday, February 15th. Obviously, since, well, faculty email is still down at NU, I think student email is up. And so I sent you an email via Canvas, and I hope you received it. I have it here on the screen in case you didn't. Basically, in light of last week's course cancellation or in class cancellation, we'll handle the following week or so as follows. Right. So this Thursday, February 20th. Be sure to have, yes, read Strunk and White's classic text, Elements of Style, in full. Think through those elements for yourself and watch video. Obviously, you're watching this lecture now and complete your rough draft of assignment 1, which is that stylistic analysis of a text of your choice, as you know, okay? And then in class, so that's what you need to do before Thursday, which hopefully the rough draft is already done. And then in class on Thursday, we will answer any questions you have on Strunk and White. I'd suggest bringing your questions. These issues, these lower level issues of style, which really end up being issues of grammar and usage, are crucial to just have as second nature for yourself. And so I'd say bring your questions. We'll also take time to peer review your rough draft of that first assignment. So be sure to bring 2 copies, hard copies, of your draft to class, and then I'll discuss the next assignment, okay? And then, owing to this shift, the assignment number 1, the stylistic analysis, isn't due this Thursday, the 20th. I've extended it on Canvas for a week, so it'll be due to be uploaded no later than class time on February 27th. I hope that clarifies any questions you have about the shifting of the course schedule in light of the cancellation. If not, of course, email me on Canvas, and I can catch that email right now, and I'll let you know once my faculty email is back up and running. So with that in mind, let's turn to Strunk and White's book, and I have a few points, a few comments I'd like to make on this classic text. So first of all, although this text is 100 years old, it is still the guiding light in America for prose composition, especially when the genre you're working in holds as a chief priority clarity. Okay, so if you look at or discuss with New York Times writers, Slate writers, Wall Street Journal, nonfiction historical texts, right? Authors of these texts, where people are really interested in clear, concise, nonfiction prose for the most part. Um, and fiction as well, but I think Strunk and White had in mind nonfiction in the writing of this. Anyhow, you ask these authors, which texts are sort of the classics in the field that still hold weight today. Most will say Strunk and White's Elements of Style. When you do break rules in against, not everyone follows Strunk and White obviously to a T, but when you do break rules, good writers are usually noticing that they're breaking the rule, and they're doing so for some good reason, right? So there's just no question about it. There's a lot of interpretation in the art form of writing, a lot of individual discretion, but it's really clear that Strunk and White is a kind of standard reference that everyone acknowledges to some degree in the world of prose writing. So it's good to just get this under your belt, and I'll step through some comments throughout 4 of the 5 parts. As you can see, it's broken into 5 parts, and I'd say that for our purposes, immediately for the class and for the quiz and for the discussion, I would be sure you really understand and use part 1, the elementary rules of usage, before moving on to part 2, 3, 4, and 5. I mean, part 1 is the ground zero. It's a place where they just, Strunk just lays out usage rules that are worth holding as conventions, and they have been conventions for almost a century and continue to be. So I would start there, make sure you get the part 1 usage rules down, then move on to parts 2, 3, 4, and 5. As you can see, White actually added Part 5, let's make sure that's right. Part 5 is, yeah, so part 5 is this approach to style, and that is Strunk's student, E.B. White, added an approach to style quite a bit later, and as you know from reading it, um, he sees part 5 as a bit of more reminders and suggestions, as opposed to the first 4 parts, which are really rules of convention for writing. At least that's the spirit of Strunk and White, okay? So in part 1, as I said, you should just know all of these rules, try to follow all of these rules, at least for the purposes of this class and the next assignment, assignment number 2. And I think they're just good advice throughout your career as a nonfiction writer, at least, especially when, as I mentioned, the chief criterion for your writing is clarity. Okay, so I'll just point out a few areas to not miss as you're reviewing part 1, and that is the second rule in part 1. In a series of 3 or more terms with a single conjunction, conjunctions being, and, or, nor, for, so, unless, use a comma after each term except the last, right? And so that rule is known as either the serial comma or the Oxford comma. And you can go online and see people arguing over whether they use this Oxford comma or not. And I think on Facebook I saw a group arguing the serial comma, and it had something like 30,000 followers. So for sort of, for word nerds, this stuff matters. And of course, for me and for all of us, I hope it matters because it does affect clarity, especially when you're considering the United States today having a large population for whom English is a second or third language, right? So the idea here is what do you mean by that? After use a comma after each term except the last. It's pretty basic, right? So you've got a case here: the American flag is red, white, and blue, and the serial comma is that comma right after white, right? Obviously, you're not going to have a comma after the last term after blue, because it's the end of the sentence. You can't use a comma to end a sentence. So you have a period there. So the so-called penultimate term, meaning the second to the last term, gets a comma after it. So the serial comma is, in this case, white. The comma after white. And so if you're using the comma in that way, right, A, comma, B, comma, and C, then you're using the serial or the Oxford comma. And so Strunk and White would give you the hearty nod there. And if you're not, the American flag is red, white, and blue. Notice the comma is missing after white. In some style guides, that's appropriate. For following Strunk and White, it would be incorrect. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say on that term, and I'll just continue on to a few other issues throughout the book. Again, be sure to know all of the rules in this section of the book. I'm just covering a few that are sort of high miss in my experience and worth a bit further discussion. The next 2 go together, and those are non-restrictive and restrictive clauses. And so here I'm referring to Strunk and White's rule number 3 on page 2, and that is, number 3 says to enclose parenthetic expressions between commas. Okay, so what are parenthetic expressions? Parenthetic, in this sense, what Strunk and White are talking about are non-restrictive clauses. Okay, a non-restrictive clause is a clause that is incidental to the meaning of the sentence, meaning it's sort of added information. Okay, it's non-restrictive. Okay, so what do you mean? What would be restrictive then? The idea here would be, in this case, the non-restrictive clause is when Napoleon was born. Okay, and the idea is, it's sort of incidental, right? Because the antecedent in this case is in 1769, okay? And so when Napoleon was born is sort of just added on as further information about 1769. It's not restricting 1769 in some way. And so you could really get rid of that when Napoleon was born, and the sentence still holds, right? In 1769, Corsica had but recently been acquired by France. So in this case, this is the example straight from Strunk and White, right? The reason they're saying this needs to be surrounded by commas, the phrase when Napoleon was born, is because they're seeing it as non-restrictive, and therefore you would need those commas, okay? The clause Bob's incidental. Yeah, it doesn't substantively limit its antecedent. The next case, if you're wondering what in the world does it mean to substantively limit an antecedent, we'll deal with that on the next example. Okay, so these are non-restrictive clauses, which again just means they are adding information to the antecedent, not limiting the scope of the antecedent. So that's correct via Strunk and White and via pretty much anyone writing standard edited English in America. So here's the opposite of that. Here's a restrictive clause. And this is where Strunk and White would say, yeah, don't use commas, right? Because if you surround a relative restrictive clause with commas, you're saying it's incidental and not required. So in my example here, which is again straight from Strunk and White, you have to assume in this case, they should have used a different example here, but they used this one. The assumption here is that if I'm the writer, the assumption here is that I have more than one cousin. Okay, so pretend you're reading a letter from me, and you know that I have more than one cousin. Okay, in that case, Bob, in this case, which is the restrictive clause, limits the antecedent, which is my cousin, okay? Right? And so because if I got rid of Bob and I just said, my cousin is a talented harpist, and you knew I had more than one cousin, you'd say, well, which cousin are you talking about? And I'd say, oh, well, Bob. So in this case, this is what's meant by a restrictive clause. Bob restricts the domain of my cousin. It's not just an additional interesting fact, as in the previous case with Napoleon. It's a case where my cousin isn't sufficiently limited, right? So it's not just any old cousin, it's the cousin Bob. And so in this case, you would not put commas on either side of Bob. Now you'll see this rule broken a lot, and they're just wrong, right? There's just no way around it. Lots of folks studied Strunk and White, in high school, got a sense of grammar, and then just let it slide over the years. And so just because you see in, websites and such, these rules being broken, it doesn't mean it's a sign of good usage on those websites. It doesn't mean Strunk and White is outdated. If you read really the top venues of English writing in America, you'll see Strunk and White upheld. Okay, so in this case, my cousin Bob is a talented harpist is correct. At the top, I'm looking, right? So in the bottom, my cousin, comma, Bob, comma, is a talented harpist, is incorrect because, again, in this case, Bob, when you use the commas, you're suggesting that Bob can be removed, that Bob is incidental. Now the bottom case that has the red X, gets confusing, right? If you only had one cousin and your audience knew that, then yes, the bottom sentence would be correct, because my cousin, the phrase my cousin, is already sufficiently limited to one person if your audience knows you only have one cousin. But the assumption here is you have many cousins, or at least more than one, and therefore Bob has to be restrictive, and you wouldn't use you wouldn't use commas like you have in the bottom case. Okay, so so that the second sentence in this whole slide, my cousin Bob, where Bob is blue, my cousin Bob is a talented harpist, is correct. That's a case following Strunk and White. Okay, we'll move on. Another issue to consider is, notice in Strunk and White where they're discussing a participial phrase at the beginning of a sentence must refer to the grammatical subject, right? So we've already talked about this when we talked about branching. And remember I said when you start using branching in your writing, sometimes you end up mismodifying objects and subjects because you're kind of just experimenting with this branching, right? You're writing in a more complex grammatical form with branching instead of just short sentences with, subject, verb, object, period, subject, verb, object, period. You're not doing that anymore, right? You're branching these sentences to increase your flow. And yes, sometimes you get into the trouble of mismodification. And Strunk and White are addressing that, right? So to properly modify, I use this example straight from Strunk and White. Walking slowly down the road, right? In our class, we would know that as a left branch, comma. Now, just like we had the case in class of, I think, my mom eating my breakfast before taking me to school, right? What Strunk and White are saying here is walking slowly down the road must modify the subject of the sentence, okay? The grammatical subject. And so in this case, he is the subject of this sentence, right? Saw is the verb. And so walking slowly down the road, so it's he who was walking slowly down the road. And while this guy was walking slowly down the road, he saw a woman accompanied by two children. This is correct. Okay, this participial phrase, which we know as the left branch, is correctly modifying the subject, he. Assuming that's what we're trying to say, right? And that's so that blue arrow shows that this is how this sentence is modified, and I'm assuming this is correct. Now, if it's not correct, and you meant to say that you saw a woman who was walking slowly down the road with two kids, then you'd have to revise it any number of ways, right? And this is one way, like he saw a woman accompanied by two children walking slowly down the road. Now you have those two right branches effectively modifying woman. Okay, so that's the case of modification. So when you open with a left branch, that leaves open, that's modifying something in the base clause. Be sure that that left branch is the left branch is modifying the subject, whether you like it or not. Okay, so when you have an opening left branch and you have a base clause, know that any ambiguity about what that left branch is doing will be answered in the subject of the sentence. And so make sure you have the correct subject in the sentence, as we do in this case, he. Okay, a few other comments. Strunk and White's prescription, or really proscription in this case, do not join independent clauses with a comma. That's their discussion of just your standard comma splice error, and be sure you know that well. I'm assuming most of you already do. We cover it in Writing 100. You've probably covered it throughout high school. If you need a refresher, don't overlook this, okay? Notice that in Strunk and White, when they discuss how to join sentences together, there really are three options. There's the semicolon, the period, and the colon. And they give good reasons for using each of those. So I would say that's worth paying attention to. Also, they proscribe us against breaking sentences in two. This is just your standard sentence fragment error, right? You need full sentences. You don't want to have sentence fragments standing as full sentences. And so if you're not familiar, if you need a refresher on sentence fragments, be sure to pay attention to this section as well. And then one limitation in this book is they don't really clearly, once you get to page 8, you'll see that their examples are in 2 columns. What they really need to have are headings on those columns. They do mention on page 8 that the left-hand column examples are the incorrect version, and the right-hand column examples are the correct version. But, headings would have helped there. So just make sure you realize from page 8 forward, when you're seeing 2 columns of examples, that the left-hand column are wrong, right? Those are things you should not be following. And then usually the right-hand column is correcting that left-hand column version. I think that's all I have to say about part 1. And I'll leave you to review part 1 on your own, read it, study it, and bring your questions to class on this coming Thursday. Part 2, I have only one thing to say, and that is, again, be sure to read it, understand it. It's a bit more abstract than part 1. Part 1 is just, rules of usage. Part 2 is a larger question of the art, the design of writing, all good advice in there. And I'll just point out that their rule number, or I guess their guideline number 19, is, express coordinate ideas in similar form. That's what we know as parallelism, which we've already discussed. So again, please have a good look at part 2. Bring any questions to class. Part 4, again, this is sort of just a litany of common diction mistakes in English that Strunk and White noticed. Funny enough, they're the very same ones that I still notice 75 years later, 50 years later in Writing 100. So I'll point out, be sure as you're reading part 4 to pay attention to, since these are high miss for a lot of folks, they might be for you, right? Pay attention to their discussion of the difference between among and between, effect and affect, farther, further, split infinitives. Notice, too, you'll see here that in part 4, where Strunk discusses not to split infinitives, White, in part 5, is a little more tolerant. And so they disagree a bit on whether split infinitives are okay or not. And so make sure you see that. I would say when in doubt, well, I shouldn't say when in doubt. You decide for yourself on the case of split infinitive, but I hope you can see Strunk and White do differ. Also that and which. And I'll lastly mention that something that's woefully outdated in the book is the discussion of gender pronouns, right? And so we've, in the last 5 years, right, in standard edited English, they is accepted as a singular gender pronoun. We don't need to keep using he or she, he and she. And so just ignore what Strunk and White are saying in part 4 regarding they, he, she, okay? And then 5, I'll just mention again. This part 5 was the addition by E.B. White years later, and he comments that these are reminders, not rules. Use them, as the context allows and with your own judgment. I'd suggest when in doubt, use them. The real answer is you really need good reasons to not follow any of the rules, any of the guidelines in this whole book. Okay, and with the exception of some of the outdated stuff on gender, which I've already mentioned, but the rest of the book is just good advice. So I hope you enjoy kind of this tour of really grammar and usage, but that is part of the discussion when people talk about style. It's oftentimes technically not a matter of style. People debate that, but we will include issues of grammar and usage in our larger vision for what style includes. Again, you know where to find me on email, on Canvas, and bring your questions on Thursday, and I'll be happy to discuss them with you. I'll also be in office hours all week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, from 1 to 3 p.m. That is a great time to come talk with me about any specific concerns you have, questions you have, feedback you have. Okay, folks, thanks. We'll see you on the 20th.